So clonal Massale is a term that we've come up with that describes this idea of selecting clones, having knowledge of what our clones are, and we're using up to 27 different clones, and then planting them in Massale fashion, so scattered wildflower in the vineyard, really with no knowledge of where they are, but this nice mix that we know works for our certain site or where we are in the valley. Clonal Massale is essentially a hybrid of Massale selection and clonal selection. So Massale selection being a selection of clones that are unknown, like in Burgundy, where they are picking the highest quality vines, taking cuttings, and then replanting those in the vineyards without knowledge of the clones. And then clonal selection, knowing what your clones are and having some idea of the characteristics of those clones, and then planting them normally side by side in a vineyard. This concept of using multiple clones and a lot of clones in a certain site came from past history with Ponzi. In 1978, my father was asked to be part of a project with Oregon State University, which was called the Winemakers Project. And what they did is they asked 3 different winemakers to plant a selection of clones. The only clones available were really coming from Davis. And there were 22 clones that were planted. And they were asked to plant these clones, evaluate them, and this was really the basis of what the university was going to recommend people plant in the valley. And that's really where the selection of the Pomard clone came from as being the most ideally suited for our climate. Meanwhile, we had this really beautiful mix of clones in a 2-acre site. We call that Abatina. And eventually my father decided, once that research was done, he blended these clones and picked them together, vinified them together. And this always became kind of the really special jewel of our cellar. This was really the highest quality wine that we made and still make for the last 30 years. So the idea of this mix of clones started very early with us. And with the entrance of the Dijon clones in the early 90s, I was able to work with these Dijon clones, really understand what they gave to the wine, and then took this concept of mixing clones, incorporated the Dijon clones, and came up with this idea of clonal Massale. Of course, that also came from my background with Burgundy, understanding how they plant in Burgundy with this really nice mix with very little knowledge of where the clones are in the vineyard. What I see as the value of this clonal Massale concept of planting is that it gives us real variation in the vineyard, meaning that if you walk down a row, you can see the different clones really clearly, especially at the point of Arizon when they're just getting ripe. Color change is completely different. Physiology of the vine, the shape of the cluster, and how they ripen. And that's the most important part to me, is that there's ability to kind of have these clones compensate for each other. And in a climate like Oregon, where we're really dependent on the variation in what we get climatically, there's ability to compensate. So in a warm vintage, you might have a clone that gives you this nice, beautiful, bright acidity. In a cooler vintage, you have those clones that are pushing the ripeness. So look at a site as a whole without having to say that's a really ripe site, that's a really cool site. You have the ability to get it right in every vintage, really. In the winery, I see this nice complexity that comes out with these different clones. You have all of these different characteristics from each clone, whether it's aromatics or fruit character or tannin structure, that is being blended for you in the vineyard. And so when you get it into the winery and you're able to make those wines, you're seeing this beautiful layering of complexity that comes out. Currently, Ponzi has 30 acres of Pinot Noir planted in clonal Massale. We've been planting this way since 2006. I currently don't know of any other vineyards in the valley or really in the U.S. that have this many clones planted in this fashion. This is really a very innovative way of planting vineyards. And I see this happening probably with Chardonnay, other varietals that come on once we have more knowledge about the clones. I think it takes a lot of time and experience to really understand the clones that you're planting and then have that faith and that conviction to understand what the blend will do together in a site. The real reward is being able to see the resulting wines from these clonal Massale sites that we've planted, the Avellana vineyard, the Abatina, and Abatina 2. These wines have given us the ability to make single vineyard wines that really reflect site and vintage, where in the past I've looked for blending different sites to really achieve that complexity. I'm able to find it in those specific sites, and I attribute that to this clonal Massale planting.